He had always loved music ever since he was a young boy. The sound of a piano, its keys pressed with care, filled him with joy. It was more than just an instrument to him. It was a way of expressing emotions, telling stories without saying a word. But as the years passed, the music became quieter and quieter in his life, until one day it stopped altogether. He never imagined that he would find himself in this position, sitting on a cold bench by the side of the road, his hands trembling from hunger and age, hoping for a small piece of kindness in a world that had long forgotten him. The old man had always taken pride in his independence. He didn't want to ask for help, never wanted to be a burden on anyone. He had lived a full life, after all. There had been times of happiness and there had been moments of sorrow, but through it all he had managed to get by. He had been a pianist, playing at local venues and sometimes for private events. He had a small apartment, a modest existence, but it was his. His wife had been the light of his life, and they had lived together in that small apartment for over 40 years. Their home was filled with laughter, with the sound of music drifting through the rooms, but when she passed away, the music stopped. After her death, the world seemed to lose its color. He tried to carry on, but it was different without her. He couldn't find the energy to play anymore, couldn't summon the will to step out into the world. His apartment became quieter and quieter as the days stretched into months. The world moved on, but he didn't. He stayed in the shadows waiting for something, anything to change. But nothing did. The grandpa's once bright life had faded into dull shades of gray. He could no longer afford the rent on his apartment, and the bills piled up. No one came to visit. He had no children, no relatives to check on him. The isolation weighed heavily on him, like an invisible chain wrapped around his chest, making it hard to breathe. His hands, once so skilled at dancing over piano keys, now shook uncontrollably from a mixture of age and hunger. He had to sell his beloved piano when the rent was due one month, and since then the sound of music had been silenced in his life. The streets outside his apartment were no better. Every day he saw people rushing by, absorbed in their own lives, their own worries. No one even glanced his way. Sometimes he would sit by the window and watch people walk past, imagining what their lives were like. They seemed so carefree, so full of purpose, and he couldn't help but envy them. His own life felt like it had lost all meaning. He had no purpose, no reason to keep going. But there was one thing that still burned inside him: his love for music. Even though he no longer had the piano, he could still remember the feeling of his fingers on the keys, the way the music would flow through him, carrying him away from the troubles of the world. He would close his eyes and imagine the sound of a grand piano, the rich, full notes filling the air, the melodies dancing in the space around him. Music had always been his escape, his sanctuary, and he longed for it again. But he had no way to get it. The world had moved on, and so had the music. One day he made a decision. He would find a way to play again. He didn't have much, but he had his hands and he had his love for music. He would go to the street corners, to the places where people gathered, and he would play for them. He didn't care if they paid attention or not. He didn't care if they gave him money or food. He just needed to play again. It was all he had left. He had heard of people who begged on the streets asking for money or food, but he didn't want to do that. He couldn't bring himself to ask for charity. Instead, he would offer something in return. His gift, his music, was the only thing he could give. He could still play. He could still share his gift with the world, even if it was just for a few moments. So one morning, with nothing more than his worn-out coat and a small sign that read, "Piano for Food," he made his way to the heart of the city. It was a busy place, full of people rushing to their jobs, to their meetings, to their lives. He found a quiet corner outside a fancy restaurant, set down his sign, and sat down at an old weathered piano that someone had abandoned there. His fingers trembled as he placed them on the keys. The cold air bit at his skin, but he didn't care. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music that flowed from his hands was beautiful, haunting. It wasn't perfect, his fingers were stiff, his hands trembling, but it didn't matter. The melody was still there, the rhythm still alive in his soul. The people who passed by didn't seem to notice at first. They were too busy with their own lives to pay attention to an old man sitting at a broken piano. But he didn't mind. He played on, pouring his heart into every note, letting the music fill the empty space around him. It was only a few minutes later when someone stopped to listen. A young woman dressed in a business suit stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes focused on the old man. She had heard the music and something about it had stopped her in her tracks. She wasn't sure why, but she felt drawn to him, to the way his hands moved over the keys, to the emotions that seemed to rise from his music. She hesitated for a moment, watching him as he played before pulling out her phone. She wasn't sure if she was being rude, but she wanted to capture the moment, to share the beauty of what she was hearing. She began recording a video, silently hoping that someone, anyone, would notice the old man and the music that he was sharing with the world. As she stood there, the sound of his piano filled the air, drifting across the street and into the bustling city. People began to slow down, drawn in by the unexpected beauty. The grandpa's music was like a secret, something rare and precious that no one had expected to find in the middle of the city. For a moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of connection. Even though the world around him was filled with people who didn't care, who didn't even notice him, the music still had the power to reach them. It was the only thing that still mattered to him. His gift, and as the day passed, the music continued. People came and went, some stopping to listen, some leaving without a second glance, but the grandpa didn't stop playing. He kept going, determined to share his music with the world. It didn't matter that it was just a few notes here and there, just a brief moment of beauty in the midst of a busy world. It was enough. The sun began to set, casting long shadows on the street, and the grandpa's fingers began to ache. His hands were cold, his stomach empty, but he kept playing. He couldn't stop now. The music was the only thing he had left, and so with every note he played, he held on to the one thing that had never abandoned him: his love for music. It was all he had. The grandpa had no idea how much time had passed since he started playing the piano. He had lost track of the world around him, caught up in the music. Every note he played felt like it had a purpose, like it was speaking directly to the heart of anyone who happened to be listening. But most of the crowd passed by, oblivious to the old man and his music. They were caught up in their own lives, their own busy worlds, too distracted to notice the quiet beauty that sat before them. At first, the grandpa thought he was invisible, that no one would ever pay attention. He didn't care, though. The music was all that mattered. He played for himself, for the memory of the music he once shared with his wife, for the joy that it brought him when he was young and carefree. He played because it was the only thing that kept him going, but as the hours passed, something strange began to happen. More and more people stopped to listen. They didn't say anything, didn't approach the piano, but they stayed. The sound of the music seemed to reach them in ways that words couldn't. It was like the grandpa's playing spoke to something deep inside them, a place they had forgotten, a place that still remembered the power of simple things like kindness and beauty. One by one, people began to take notice. It wasn't a big crowd, not at first. Just a handful of curious passers-by who were caught off guard by the haunting melody that filled the air. They stood at a distance, some of them fumbling with their phones, others just standing still, absorbing the music as if it were a rare gift. There was something about it that resonated, something about the way the old man played as if his very soul was poured into every note. It wasn't flawless, but it was real. The grandpa didn't notice the woman at first. She was standing off to the side, her phone in hand, recording a video of his performance. She was younger than him, dressed in a crisp business suit, her hair tied neatly in a bun. She looked like someone who had everything figured out, someone who had a purpose. Yet, as she stood there, her eyes locked on the old man's weathered hands as they moved over the piano keys, it was as if she was drawn to him, unable to tear her gaze away. She had been walking by when she first heard the music, and something about it stopped her. She wasn't in a hurry, but she felt a pull to stay. She had heard plenty of street performers before, but this was different. There was a depth to the sound, a raw emotion that she couldn't explain. She found herself frozen in place, not wanting to leave, not wanting to miss a single note. She raised her phone, hoping to capture the moment, but more than that, she wanted to remember the feeling that had wrapped around her heart and made everything else fade away. As the grandpa continued playing, she noticed the weariness in his hands, the slight tremble in his fingers. She knew he must be old, much older than anyone would expect to find playing on a street corner. But despite his age, despite his fragile appearance, his music was still strong. It was like he had tapped into something timeless, something that couldn't be measured by age or appearance. She wasn't sure why she felt so connected to the music, why it touched her in a way she couldn't describe. She had grown up with music too. Her father had played guitar, and she remembered sitting in their living room as a child listening to him strum out melodies. But this was different. This wasn't a concert or a performance for a crowd. This was something raw and intimate, something that spoke to the heart of the matter. As the minutes turned into hours, the crowd began to grow. A few more people had stopped, all of them listening intently. The grandpa, oblivious to the attention he was getting, continued to play. His music filled the space around him, creating an atmosphere that was almost magical. It was as if the world had paused for just a moment, holding its breath to listen. The woman kept recording, her phone now set to capture every second of the performance. She didn't know why she was doing it, but it felt like something important was happening, something that deserved to be remembered. She knew she would look back at the video someday and wonder why she had been so moved by a simple street performer, an old man with tired hands and a weathered coat. But for now, she just wanted to be in the moment, to listen, to feel. The grandpa's hands began to slow, the notes growing softer, more delicate. His fingers were aching, his body exhausted from the cold and the long hours of playing. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't bring himself to. It had been so long since he had played like this, so long since he had shared his gift with anyone. The music was all he had left. It was the one thing he could still give, and he wasn't going to stop until the last note was played. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the crowd was beginning to thin out. Some people had left, others had moved on to their destinations, but there were still a few stragglers lingering to listen just a little longer. The woman was still there, her phone recording the fading notes as the grandpa finished his song. The sound hung in the air, soft and sweet, until it finally stopped. The grandpa took a deep breath, his hands resting on the keys, his head hanging low. He was tired, so very tired, but there was a sense of peace that filled him now. He had done what he set out to do. He had shared his music, and for a brief moment it had been enough. He opened his eyes, looking around at the people who had stopped to listen. Most of them had left, but a few were still hanging around, staring at him with a strange mix of admiration and sympathy. He didn't expect anything from them, and he certainly didn't want to beg for anything. But his stomach growled loudly, reminding him of the hunger that had been gnawing at him all day. He hadn't eaten since the morning, and he was starting to feel weak. He slowly stood up from the piano, his knees creaking with the effort. His hands were stiff from the cold, and his fingers ached from playing for so long, but he didn't care. He felt a small sense of pride in what he had done. He had played, and for a little while the world had listened. That was all he could ask for. As he stood there, about to gather his things and leave, the woman who had been recording the video approached him. She had stopped filming and was now standing in front of him, looking at him with a soft smile on her face. Her eyes were kind, but there was something else there too. Something deeper, like she understood more than just the surface of what had happened. "Thank you," she said softly. "That was beautiful. You have such a gift." The grandpa smiled weakly, his voice hoarse from hours of playing. "Thank you, miss. I just needed to play. It's the only thing I have left." She nodded, her smile still gentle. "I can tell. I know what it's like to need something that you don't have anymore." There was a brief silence between them, as if she was deciding whether or not to say more. Finally, she spoke again. "Are you hungry?" The grandpa's eyes widened slightly at the question. He hadn't expected anyone to offer him food. He had been hoping for a kind word or a small donation, but food? That was something different, something he hadn't even dared to ask for. "Yes," he said quietly. "I haven't eaten in a while." She didn't hesitate. "Come with me. I'll buy you something to eat." The grandpa hesitated for just a moment. He didn't want to accept charity, but there was something in her eyes, something that made him feel like he wasn't a burden, like he wasn't taking advantage of her kindness. He had nothing to lose, and the hunger was becoming unbearable. So with a grateful nod, he agreed. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world hadn't forgotten him completely. This concludes part 2. Would you like me to continue with more or make any adjustments? The woman led the grandpa down the street, her pace quick and purposeful, as though she had a destination in mind. The grandpa, despite his hunger and exhaustion, couldn't help but notice how confident she seemed. She was young, dressed well, and walked with a sense of direction that he admired. For a moment he wondered what her life must be like. She had everything: youth, opportunity, a bright future. And yet she had stopped for him, a stranger. An old man with nothing to offer but music. He felt a mix of gratitude and confusion. Why had she stopped? Why had she chosen him out of all the people walking past? He wasn't sure, but there was something about the way she had listened to him. Really listened, that made him feel seen. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't invisible. The walk was short. They arrived at a small, cozy cafe a few blocks away from the street corner where he had been playing. It was a simple place. The kind of cafe that wasn't too fancy but still had a warmth to it. The kind of place that felt like it could be a second home. The door chimed softly as they stepped inside, and the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods greeted them. The grandpa's stomach growled again, louder this time, and he felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment. The woman turned to him with a kind smile. "What would you like? Anything you want, it's on me." He hadn't eaten much in days and his stomach ached. There were so many choices, so many things he could never afford. He stared at the menu for a moment, trying to decide, but his mind was too clouded by hunger to make a decision. Finally, he just shrugged and said, "Anything is fine." The woman nodded and ordered 2 coffees and a sandwich for him. She was polite, her tone soft and warm, and it made the grandpa feel at ease. He could see how her kindness wasn't just a momentary act. It was something that came naturally to her. It was as though she had always been like this, offering help to those in need without thinking twice. They sat at a small table by the window. The grandpa had his sandwich in front of him, the aroma making his mouth water, but he felt a little awkward. He wasn't used to being treated this way. He had always been the one to give, to help others, but now here he was sitting across from a stranger who was offering him a meal. It was humbling in a way, but it also made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As he took a bite of the sandwich, he looked out the window. The city was bustling with life. People were walking by, rushing to their own destinations. They were all moving so quickly, wrapped up in their own worlds, and here he was, sitting in a cafe with a woman who had stopped for him, a woman who had taken the time to notice him. "So, what's your name?" the woman asked, breaking the silence. The grandpa looked up, startled. He hadn't expected her to ask. He hadn't even realized that they hadn't exchanged names. He thought about it for a moment, then smiled faintly. "It's just Grandpa," he said with a shrug, feeling a little self-conscious. "I've been called that for as long as I can remember." She smiled back at him. "I see. Well, Grandpa seems like a good name for someone who knows how to touch people's hearts with music." The grandpa chuckled softly, his heart warmed by her words. "I don't know about that. I just play because it makes me feel alive. I'm not much of a performer, just someone who loves music." The woman nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Music is a powerful thing. It has the ability to connect people, to make them feel something real. I think that's why it touched me today. It wasn't just about the music. It was about what you were willing to give." The grandpa looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. He hadn't thought about it like that. To him, music had always been an escape, a way to forget about the pain and the loneliness. He played because it made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Joy, even if just for a moment. But the idea that it could touch someone else, that it could connect him to another person, was something he hadn't considered. It made him realize how much he had been hiding, how much he had been afraid to share. "I never thought of it that way," he said quietly, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "I've just been playing for myself, trying to hold on to something from the past. I didn't think anyone would care." The woman leaned forward, her expression sincere. "That's exactly why I care. You have a gift. And you shouldn't hide it, not for one more day. People need to hear it, Grandpa. They need to hear what you have to say." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always thought of his music as something small, something insignificant in the grand scheme of life. But maybe, just maybe, it was more than that. Maybe it was something that could touch other people's lives too. "I don't know if anyone would want to hear it," he said softly, feeling vulnerable. "I'm old. My hands shake. The world has changed. Who's going to listen to an old man like me?" The woman smiled gently. "You'd be surprised. People are more willing to listen than you think. You just have to believe in yourself." The grandpa didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure he could believe in himself again, not after everything that had happened. But sitting there in this quiet cafe with a kind stranger, he felt something stir inside him. A glimmer of hope, just a tiny spark, that maybe he wasn't done yet. Maybe he could still do something meaningful. Maybe the music still had a place in this world. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee, and for the first time in a long time, the grandpa felt at peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that in that moment things didn't feel so hopeless. He wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't alone. There were people who cared, who saw him, who heard his music and understood its value. That was enough. Eventually, the woman finished her coffee and stood up. "It was really nice talking to you, Grandpa." "I'm glad I stopped." The grandpa smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Thank you. I don't know what to say. I've never met anyone like you." She gave him a warm smile. "You don't need to say anything. Just keep playing. Keep sharing your gift with the world." With that, she left, disappearing into the crowd outside. The grandpa sat there for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from him. He felt a strange sense of loss, even though she had only been a stranger just a short time ago. But more than that, he felt something new, something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. He wasn't sure where his journey would take him, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out. Would you like me to continue with part 4 or make any adjustments to this part? The days following the grandpa's encounter with the woman at the cafe felt different. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness. He woke up each morning with a sense of something new, something he couldn't quite explain. He had been given a glimpse of hope, a reminder that maybe his music still had meaning in this fast-paced world. The woman's words echoed in his mind, urging him to believe in himself again. After that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his life than what he had been living. Maybe he could play again, share his gift with others and not just for himself. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Could he really go back to playing like he used to? Could he make a difference with his music again? He decided to try. One morning, he picked up his tattered sign that simply read "Piano for Food" and headed back to the street corner where he had played before. The familiar hustle and bustle of the city surrounded him, but this time it felt different. He felt different. There was a small spark of excitement within him, and he couldn't help but smile to himself. He had no expectations, no promises, but he was willing to try. He just had to play. As he set up the old piano, the people walking by seemed to notice him again. A few glanced over, but most kept walking. The grandpa wasn't discouraged. He took a deep breath and began to play, his fingers finding the familiar keys with ease. The music was slow at first, gentle, almost as though he was testing the air, feeling his way back into the rhythm of playing for others. It wasn't long before a few people stopped to listen. The sound of the piano seemed to stop them in their tracks, and before he knew it, a small crowd had gathered. The grandpa's hands moved more confidently now, the music flowing more freely as if the notes were carrying a message, a story he had to tell. He was no longer just playing for food or for survival. He was playing because he had something to say, something to share. One of the people in the crowd was a young man who had stopped in front of the piano, his arms crossed as he watched the old man play. He was dressed in a suit, looking like someone who had just come from work. But there was something about the way he stood, the way his eyes were fixed on the grandpa, that made the old man feel like he wasn't just another passerby. The young man seemed different. After a few minutes, the young man approached the grandpa, his face serious but kind. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice sincere. "You're really talented." The grandpa paused for a moment, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet, almost unsure. "I just play what comes to me," the young man smiled. "It's not just what comes to you, it's something more than that. You've got a real gift. People don't stop like this unless something speaks to them." He glanced around at the small crowd, some of whom were still listening intently to the music. "You've got people's attention." The grandpa looked around too. There were about 10 people standing near him, some with their phones out recording the music. It wasn't a huge crowd, but it was enough to make him feel something he hadn't felt in years, recognized. Not just as an old man on the street, but as a musician, as someone who still had something valuable to offer. "You've got talent," the young man continued, his eyes thoughtful. "Why don't you come perform at my venue? We could give you a spot. You can play for real audiences, people who would appreciate it." The grandpa's heart skipped a beat. Perform at a venue? He hadn't played in front of an audience in so long. The thought was both exciting and overwhelming. What if he wasn't good enough? What if people didn't like his music? What if he made a fool of himself? But there was also something deep inside him, something that told him this might be his chance. A chance to do what he loved again, a chance to feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. He took a breath, then nodded slowly. "I'm not sure," he said quietly, his voice uncertain. "It's been so long. I don't know if I can—" The young man smiled. "It's just a small venue. Nothing too fancy. Just you and your music. But I think you've got something worth sharing. People will listen. You'll see." The grandpa hesitated, then looked around at the crowd that had gathered, their faces soft with admiration. He had been playing for food, for survival, but now it felt like there was more to it. Maybe he could do this. Maybe he could play for an audience again, just like he used to. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steadying. "I'll give it a try." The young man grinned. "That's what I like to hear. Let me know when you're ready and I'll get everything set up." As the crowd slowly dispersed, the grandpa felt a surge of excitement rush through him. He had just agreed to something he never thought he'd do again. A small performance, but it was something. It was a step. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward. Over the next few days, the grandpa spent hours practicing at home. His hands were still shaky, but the more he played, the more confident he became. He found a rhythm again, his fingers moving across the keys with ease. The music came back to him, flowing through his fingers like it had never left. He was rediscovering something that had been buried for so long. A passion, a part of himself that he thought he'd lost. When the day of the performance finally came, the grandpa felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew one thing. This was his chance. His chance to show the world that he still had something to give, that he wasn't finished yet. He arrived at the venue, a small club tucked away on a quiet street. The place was modest, but it had a certain charm. The atmosphere was warm, cozy, with dim lighting and a small stage at the front. There were only a few people in the audience, but that didn't matter. It was the start of something new. It was his moment. The young man was there, welcoming him with a smile. "You're here. We're ready when you are." The grandpa took a deep breath, walked up to the stage and sat down at the piano. He could feel the eyes of the small audience on him, but this time it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like support. The music was his to share, and he was ready. He started to play, the familiar melody filling the air, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. The music flowed from him effortlessly, each note finding its place in the air. He played not for food or for survival, but for the joy of sharing something beautiful. For the joy of being alive. The audience sat in silence, listening to every note, every chord. The grandpa played like he had never played before, his hands dancing over the keys with a grace and confidence that surprised even him. It was as if the music had unlocked something within him, something he thought was lost forever. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Then the audience erupted into applause. The grandpa looked up, his heart swelling with emotion. For a moment, he couldn't believe it. He had done it. He had played for an audience, and they had appreciated it. They had listened. As the applause faded, the young man stepped forward, clapping along with the crowd. "That was incredible," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You've still got it. You're amazing." The grandpa smiled, his eyes misting over. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I didn't think I could do it again, but it feels good.
It feels like
I'm alive again." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. He was alive, and he still had a gift to share with the world. After that first performance at the small club, the grandpa found himself in a new rhythm. Each night he played his music for audiences who had no expectations, no preconceived notions of who he was. They didn't care about his age or the tremble in his hands or the lines on his face. They only cared about the music. And in a way, that was all he cared about too. The young man who had first invited him to perform continued to support him, booking him at various small venues around the city. Word began to spread about the old man who played the piano with such passion and heart, and soon he was playing at different spots each week. People came in from all over to hear him play, and the grandpa began to feel a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer a forgotten soul on the streets. He was an artist sharing his gift with the world, but it wasn't just about the performances. There were moments in between the music, moments that touched him even more than the applause, like when an elderly couple came up to him after a show, their faces wrinkled with years of life, their hands holding each other tightly, "That was beautiful," the woman said, tears in her eyes. "You remind me of my husband when we were young. He used to play just like that." The grandpa smiled softly, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Music has a way of staying with us, doesn't it?" She nodded, and her husband placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's been years since we've heard music like that. Thank you for reminding us of the good times." As they walked away, the grandpa couldn't help but feel moved. Music had always been a source of solace for him, but now it seemed to be giving comfort to others too. He had started to realize that his music wasn't just a way for him to escape. It was a way for others to feel something, to remember, to heal. There were other moments like that too. A man came up to him one night and asked if he could dedicate a song to his late mother. The grandpa, without hesitation, played the soft, mournful melody the man requested. When he finished, the man was standing there wiping his eyes. "That was exactly what I needed to hear," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." The grandpa nodded quietly. It wasn't always easy, opening up to strangers like that, sharing a piece of his soul. But the more he did it, the more it seemed to connect him to the people around him. He began to understand that music wasn't just an individual experience, it was a shared one. It was something that brought people together, made them feel less alone, even if just for a few minutes. As the months passed, the grandpa's life changed in ways he couldn't have predicted. He had become something of a local legend, the old man who played the piano in the corner of a cafe or a bar, pouring his heart into every note. But with this new recognition came new challenges. The grandpa had always been a solitary person, content to stay in the background. Now he was being pulled into the spotlight. He was meeting new people, forming connections, and even gaining a bit of fame. It was all so new to him, and sometimes it was overwhelming. One evening, after a particularly packed performance, the grandpa found himself sitting alone backstage, his hands resting on his lap as he reflected on how far he had come. He had played for hours, his fingers aching. But the feeling that lingered in him wasn't just fatigue, it was a deep sense of fulfillment. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He was doing what he loved, and he was being appreciated for it. But with this new life came the complexities of managing it. There were contracts to sign, bookings to confirm, and people wanting to take advantage of his success. The grandpa wasn't used to any of this. He had spent so many years simply surviving that the world of business and fame felt foreign to him. He didn't know how to navigate it, and at times he felt like he was drowning in the paperwork, the demands, and the constant attention. One day he sat down with the young man who had first helped him. They were in a small cafe, sitting across from each other as the grandpa sipped his coffee. "I don't know if I can keep up with all of this," the grandpa admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "The gigs are great, but the business side of things, it's too much for me. I'm not built for all this." The young man listened intently, nodding understandingly. "I get it. It's a lot. But you don't have to do it all alone. I can help you with the business side, take care of the contracts and all that stuff. You just focus on your music." The grandpa looked at him, grateful but reluctant. "I don't want to be a burden on you. You've already done so much for me." "You're not a burden," the young man said firmly. "You've got a gift and the world deserves to hear it. I'm just here to make sure you can focus on what you do best. Let me handle the rest." The grandpa felt a wave of relief wash over him. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to do this alone. Maybe there were people in his life who would help him, support him, and make sure his music reached as many people as possible. The thought made him feel less isolated, less alone. A few weeks later, the grandpa found himself on a stage at a larger venue, playing to a packed crowd. The lights were brighter, the sound system louder, and the people were more excited. But despite the size of the audience, despite the high stakes, the grandpa felt a calmness he had never experienced before. The nerves that had once consumed him before a performance had faded. He wasn't playing for approval or fame anymore. He was playing because it was what he was meant to do. The music flowed effortlessly from his fingers, each note more powerful than the last. When the performance ended, the audience stood and cheered. It wasn't just applause, it was admiration, recognition for something beautiful. The grandpa stood there stunned. He had played for years in small clubs, on street corners, but this was different. He had played in front of hundreds of people, and they had heard him. They had understood what he was trying to say. As the applause died down, the grandpa took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had made it. Backstage, the young man greeted him with a proud smile. "You did amazing. People loved it." The grandpa nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I didn't think I could, but I did." The young man clapped him on the back. "You're just getting started. This is only the beginning." For the grandpa, it felt like the end of a long journey, a journey that had started with a broken heart, with hunger and loneliness, but had led him to something greater. He had rediscovered his passion, his love for music, and in the process, had found a new family in the people who had come to hear him play. And as he stood there, backstage, his heart full and his soul at peace, he knew that his story wasn't over. It had only just begun. Music had given him a second chance at life, and he was going to make the most of it. The grandpa's life was transforming, and he wasn't sure how to process all the changes. Every day felt like a new adventure, each performance more exhilarating than the last. But amidst all the excitement, there were moments of doubt, moments when he wondered if he was truly ready for everything that was happening. It wasn't just the performances that had changed. His whole life had shifted. No longer was he waking up to a cold, empty apartment with nothing but the sound of his own thoughts. Now there were emails to read, schedules to follow, and more people asking for his time. Some of them were just fans expressing admiration for his music. Others were people offering opportunities, agents, promoters, even record labels. It was all happening so quickly, and for a man who had spent years in isolation, it was overwhelming. But despite the whirlwind of activity around him, one thing remained constant: the piano. Whenever he felt too caught up in the rush of it all, he would sit at the keys, his hands instinctively finding the familiar notes, and everything else would fade away. In those moments, the world made sense again. The music was still the most important thing, and everything else was just noise. One evening, after a particularly busy week of performances and interviews, the grandpa found himself sitting alone in a quiet cafe, nursing a cup of coffee. He had just finished another show, and his body was sore from the long hours. His fingers ached from playing, but the satisfaction of the performance lingered. It was a different kind of tiredness, one that came from doing something he loved, something that brought joy to others. As he sat there reflecting on the past few months, the door to the cafe opened and a familiar face walked in. It was the young man who had first discovered him, the one who had helped him get started in the world of music again. He had become a close friend, someone the grandpa could trust. The young man spotted him right away and walked over, a smile spreading across his face. "You look like you could use a break," he said, sitting down across from the grandpa. The grandpa smiled tiredly. "I think you're right. It's been a whirlwind these past few weeks." The young man nodded sympathetically. "I can only imagine. You've been getting a lot of attention lately. I saw your performance last night." "The place was packed." The grandpa chuckled, shaking his head. "I still can't believe it. Sometimes I feel like I'm dreaming. One moment I'm playing for food, and the next I'm playing in front of hundreds of people." The young man leaned in, his voice lowering. "And that's just the beginning. We've got more bookings coming up, bigger shows, more exposure. You're becoming a name people recognize." The grandpa felt a pang of nervousness in his chest. "It's exciting, sure, but it's also a lot to handle. I never imagined my music would get so much attention. I don't know if I'm ready for all of this." The young man looked at him with understanding. "It's normal to feel that way, but you've earned it. You've worked hard to get here, and people are responding to what you've got. You're not just a performer. You're an inspiration. You've got something that touches people, and that's rare." The grandpa looked down at his coffee, swirling it gently. He had never thought of himself as an inspiration. To him, he was just a man with a gift, doing what he loved. But hearing it from someone else, hearing the way people spoke about him, made him realize how far he had come. "I never expected any of this," he said quietly. "I just wanted to play, to feel the music again." The young man smiled. "And that's exactly why people connect with you. You're real. You're not chasing fame or fortune. You're just sharing your music, and that's why it resonates. But I get it. The pressure is a lot. And you're not alone in this. I'm here to help." The grandpa felt a sense of relief wash over him. It was comforting to know that he didn't have to navigate this new life alone. He had someone who understood the challenges, someone who believed in him. "I appreciate everything you've done for me," the grandpa said, his voice sincere. "I don't know what I'd have done without you." The young man shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. You're the one who's putting in the work. You're the one making the magic happen." I'm just here to make sure you've got everything you need." As they continued talking, the grandpa felt a new sense of determination. He couldn't let the fear of the unknown stop him. He had come this far and he wasn't going to let it slip away. He had found something that made him feel alive again, and he was going to embrace it, no matter how overwhelming it seemed. The next few weeks flew by in a blur. The grandpa played in more venues, from small clubs to larger concert halls. Each performance brought a new wave of excitement, and he found himself more and more comfortable with the attention. The nerves that had once plagued him before stepping on stage were starting to fade. He was no longer just a street performer. He was an artist with a story to tell, and the world was finally listening. But despite the growing success, there were moments of doubt. As he stood on stage looking out at the crowd, he would sometimes catch himself wondering if it was all real. Could he really keep this up? Could he continue to share his music with the world in a way that felt true to himself? One evening, after a particularly successful performance, the grandpa found himself standing backstage, looking at the crowd through the curtains. He could still hear their applause ringing in his ears. It was a feeling he had never thought he'd experience again, the feeling of being seen, of being appreciated. But along with that joy came a sense of pressure, a weight he wasn't sure how to carry. The young man appeared beside him, noticing the thoughtful expression on the grandpa's face. "You did great tonight," he said, giving him a pat on the back. The grandpa nodded, still lost in his thoughts. "It's all just so much. Sometimes I don't know if I can keep up with it all." The young man raised an eyebrow. "You mean the performances or everything that comes with it? The business side, the fame?" The grandpa exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping slightly. "All of it. I don't know if I'm cut out for this. I never wanted fame, never wanted all this attention. I just wanted to play." The young man studied him for a moment before speaking. "You don't have to chase fame or attention. The music is what matters. You're not doing this for anyone else. You're doing it for yourself, for the love of the music, and that's what makes it real." The grandpa smiled faintly, the weight on his shoulders easing a little. "You're right. I got caught up in the business side of things. I've been so focused on everything that I forgot why I started playing in the first place." The young man placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry. You're doing fine. Just remember why you started. Everything else will fall into place." The grandpa nodded, feeling the truth in the young man's words. It wasn't about the fame, the recognition, or the pressure of performing. It was about the music, about sharing something real with the world. As long as he held on to that, everything else would work itself out. The next day, the grandpa woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let the pressure take away the joy of playing. He was going to continue doing what he loved, sharing his gift with anyone who would listen. If the world wanted to watch, he would let them. But in the end, it was the music that mattered. That night, he took the stage again, and this time there was no hesitation, no fear. He played for himself, for the love of the music, and for the people who needed to hear it. The crowd responded with cheers and applause, but the grandpa didn't focus on that. He focused on the notes, the melody, the rhythm. He focused on the music, and for the first time in a long time, he felt completely at peace. The grandpa's life had changed in ways he never thought possible. From being a man lost in the shadows, playing his piano in a quiet corner of the street for the few who passed by, to becoming a respected artist with people lining up to hear him play. Everything seemed like a dream. But as time went on, the grandpa started to notice something else. The deeper the success went, the more he found himself missing the simpler days. The days when his only concern was the music itself, when there were no expectations and no pressure. In a quiet moment one evening, after a long day of performances and interviews, the grandpa sat at his piano in the small apartment that had become his home. He had played for hours earlier that day, yet something tugged at him as he ran his fingers gently over the keys. He could feel it, the change inside him. There was a growing restlessness, a sense that all the attention was starting to feel heavier, and it was pulling him away from what truly mattered. He closed his eyes, listening to the soft melody that filled the room. And for a moment he forgot about everything else. The shows, the contracts, the crowded rooms. He just listened to the music. It was always his escape, his refuge, and now it seemed like it was the only thing that could bring him peace. He had come so far, but in all that success, there was still a part of him that longed for the quiet days of his past. The days when he could simply play without any expectations. The days when his music was his alone. The next morning he decided to take a break. He didn't have any shows lined up for a few days, and he needed to recharge. The grandpa packed a small bag and decided to leave the city for a while. He needed time to reflect on what he really wanted, to reconnect with himself and the music that had saved him. He boarded a bus to a small town, a place he had visited years ago, a place where no one knew who he was, and he could just be another face in the crowd. The journey was long, but he didn't mind. The quiet of the road was soothing. It was the silence he had craved. When he arrived, he found a little bed and breakfast by a lake, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the world. The owners were kind and welcoming, but they didn't ask many questions. That was exactly what he needed. No one knew his story here. No one expected him to perform or be anything other than what he was, an old man who loved playing the piano. The grandpa spent his days walking along the shore of the lake, watching the sun rise and set, and spending quiet evenings in the small cabin. In the mornings, he would sit at a piano in the bed and breakfast lounge, playing soft melodies that blended with the natural sounds of the place. The air was fresh, and the peace of the town seemed to seep into his soul. For the first time in a long while, he felt free. One morning, while he was playing a slow, peaceful tune, an older woman entered the lounge. She was kind-looking with gray, hair pulled back in a loose bun, wearing a soft sweater and jeans. She stopped in her tracks when she heard the music, her eyes closing for a brief moment as if she was savoring the sound. "Beautiful," she said softly, approaching the grandpa. He smiled warmly, feeling the familiarity of playing for someone who wasn't expecting anything. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't play for anyone in particular. Just for myself, really." The woman nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Sometimes playing for yourself is the most important thing. It's where the soul shines through." The grandpa didn't know why, but something about her words struck a chord deep inside him. He hadn't thought about his music like that in a while. He had gotten caught up in the performances, the crowds, and the attention. But here, in this small, quiet place, it felt like he was playing for the right reasons again. He wasn't performing for anyone else. He was simply playing, and in doing so, he was reconnecting with the music and the person he used to be. They talked for a while, the woman telling him stories about the town and her life. She had lived here for years, content with her peaceful routine, and she had a gentle wisdom about her that the grandpa admired. As they spoke, he realized how much he missed simple human connection, how much he longed for conversations that weren't about his music or his career, but about life, real life. Later that afternoon, the woman invited him to join her for a cup of tea on the porch of the bed and breakfast. They sat together, the warm breeze rustling the leaves in the trees, and they talked about everything and nothing. It was the kind of conversation he had missed, the kind that didn't require him to perform, to be anything other than who he was. As they spoke, the grandpa found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in a long time. He talked about his past, his music, and the struggles he had faced. He talked about the loneliness he had felt for years and how music had been his only escape. The woman listened intently, nodding every now and then, but she didn't offer advice or try to fix anything. She just listened, and that was enough. The days that followed were filled with more quiet moments, more walks by the lake, and more time spent at the piano. The grandpa started to feel like he had rediscovered a part of himself that he had lost in the chaos of his newfound fame. He remembered why he started playing in the first place, not for money, not for fame, but because music was a part of who he was. It had always been that way. But there was one thing that still weighed on his mind. As much as he enjoyed the peace and quiet of the town, he knew that he couldn't hide forever. He had come a long way, and his music had touched so many people's lives. He had a gift, and he knew that he couldn't let it go to waste. It was a struggle, though. The pressure, the expectations, the demands, it all felt so overwhelming at times. The grandpa often found himself torn between wanting to stay in this peaceful town, away from the spotlight, and wanting to share his music with the world. He couldn't ignore the pull of his passion, but he also couldn't ignore the toll it had taken on him. One evening, as he sat on the porch, the woman came out with a gentle smile. "You've been quiet lately," she said, sitting beside him. "Is everything all right?" The grandpa sighed, running his hands through his graying hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm torn. I love playing for people, but it's been so much lately. I feel like I'm losing touch with the music itself. It's no longer just mine. She listened, her gaze soft. You've been given a gift. It's not just about you anymore, is it? But that doesn't mean you have to lose yourself in it. You have to find a balance. You can share your gift, but you also have to stay true to who you are. The grandpa thought about her words, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. She was right. He didn't have to choose between the two extremes. He didn't have to retreat into obscurity, nor did he have to give everything up for fame. He could continue to share his music with the world, but he could also protect the part of himself that made the music worth sharing in the first place. The next day, he packed his bag and boarded the bus back to the city, but this time he wasn't feeling overwhelmed. He was ready. He knew that he had a purpose, and he was going to embrace it on his own terms. He would play for the people, yes, but he would also make time for the quiet moments, the moments when it was just him and the piano, just like it always had been. As the bus made its way back, the grandpa gazed out the window, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was going to live his life with the music as his guide. And as long as he stayed true to himself, he knew that whatever came next would be worth it. The grandpa's return to the city felt different. The crowds, the performances, the bright lights, everything that had once seemed so overwhelming now felt like part of a larger story. He had gone away to find peace, to reconnect with himself and his music, and now he was back, not as someone trying to escape the chaos, but as someone ready to embrace it on his own terms. He stepped off the bus and made his way to the small apartment he had come to call home. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was his place of refuge, the space where he could close the door and just be himself. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, taking in the familiar surroundings. The worn-out furniture, the shelves filled with old records, the piano by the window. Everything was just as he had left it, but there was a subtle shift within him. He no longer felt like an outsider here. He had earned his place in this world, not through fame or fortune, but through his music. The next day, the grandpa sat at the piano, his fingers finding the familiar keys once again. The soft melody filled the room, and as he played, he couldn't help but smile. The music was his, and no matter what happened in the future, that would always be true. He wasn't playing for anyone else anymore. He was playing for himself, for the joy it brought him, for the peace it gave him. As he finished playing, he heard a soft knock on the door. He stood up and opened it to find the young man who had helped him get started in the music world. The young man had been a constant presence in his life, guiding him through the chaos, helping him navigate the world of performances and contracts. The grandpa had come to rely on him, and he was grateful for the support. "Hey, you're back," the young man said, his voice cheerful. "How was the trip?" The grandpa smiled and motioned for him to come in. "It was good, quiet. I needed some time to clear my head." The young man raised an eyebrow. "Clear your head, huh? Sounds like you've got a lot on your mind." The grandpa nodded, sitting down on the couch. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About why I started playing in the first place, about what it all means. I needed to remember why I do this, why I love it." The young man sat down beside him. "I get it. It's easy to get caught up in everything that comes with success. The attention, the pressure, the expectations. But it's good that you took some time for yourself. It's important to stay grounded." The grandpa leaned back, his hands resting on his lap. "I realized something while I was away. I don't have to do everything all at once. I can take it slow, play when I want to, perform when I'm ready. It's not about how many people show up or how many contracts I sign. It's about the music, and that's something I can control." The young man smiled. "That's the spirit. I've always known you had a lot more to offer than just being a performer. You've got a gift, and you've touched a lot of people with it." The grandpa looked at him, grateful for his words. "I'm starting to believe that again. For a while, I forgot what it felt like to just play for the love of it." The young man nodded. "Well, you've still got plenty of people who want to hear it. There are a few more shows lined up, but if you ever want to take a break, just let me know." "It's all about balance," the grandpa thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I think I'm ready. Ready to go back out there, but on my terms. I'm not chasing anything anymore. I'm just going to play and let things fall where they may." Over the next few weeks, the grandpa found a new rhythm. He played when he felt like it, took breaks when he needed them, and made time for the things that brought him joy outside of music. The pressure of being constantly in the spotlight had lessened, and he was able to focus on what really mattered: the connection between him and the music, and the simple pleasure of sharing that music with others. His performances became more intimate, more personal. He played in smaller venues where the audience could feel the emotions in his music, where they could connect with him on a deeper level. And each time he performed, he was reminded of why he started playing in the first place, not for fame or recognition, but because music was the language of his soul. One evening, after a particularly moving performance, the grandpa sat in the quiet of his dressing room, reflecting on the night. The applause had been warm, but it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the feeling he had when he played, the way the music had flowed from him without hesitation, as though it was coming from a place deep inside. He had given everything he had to that moment, and in return the music had filled him up. As he packed up his things, the young man came in smiling. "You were incredible tonight," he said. "You've never played better." The grandpa looked up, a smile tugging at his lips. It felt different tonight. It wasn't about performing for a crowd. It was about sharing something real with them. The young man nodded, his expression serious. "And that's why people love you? You're not just playing for them, you're playing with them. You're giving them something they can feel." The grandpa paused, thinking about his words. It was true. He wasn't just performing anymore. He was sharing his soul with his audience, and in doing so, he had created something far more meaningful than any applause or recognition could ever offer. In the weeks that followed, the grandpa continued to perform, but he no longer worried about how many people showed up or how much money he was making. He played because he loved it. And as the months passed, his following grew. Not because of his fame, but because people could feel the authenticity in his music. One day, he received a letter, a formal invitation to perform at a prestigious concert hall. It was an opportunity he had never imagined, one that would bring him before an even larger audience. But as he stared at the letter, he felt no excitement, only a quiet certainty. It was an offer, but it wasn't the kind of performance he was seeking. The grandpa knew that his heart lay in the smaller venues, in the intimate connections he made with his audience, not in the grandeur of large, impersonal stages. He turned the letter over and wrote a short note of his own. He politely declined the offer, thanking them for considering him, but explaining that his music was better suited to a more personal setting. It was a simple decision, but one that felt right. As the years went on, the grandpa continued to play in small venues, sharing his music with people who understood the heart of it. He became a beloved figure not because he was famous, but because his music touched people's lives in a way few others could. He never sought the spotlight, but it found him anyway. And in the end, it was the music that had made him truly shine. One evening, as the grandpa sat at his piano, playing softly to himself, he thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. He had come from a place of loneliness and struggle, from a life of hardship and doubt. But through it all, music had been his constant companion, his way out, his way in. He had shared it with the world, and in return, the world had shared its love with him. The grandpa closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he didn't need to. He had found peace in the present, and that was enough. And as the notes of the piano filled the room, he knew that no matter where his journey took him, he would always have music, and that was all he needed.